So friends, today I'm going to be discussing chapter 1 of Never Caught, the Washington's relentless pursuit of their runaway slave owner judge. This is not fiction. This is well documented about George Washington and his obsession with owner judge. I'm going to be taking it chapter by chapter and really breaking it down and getting your thoughts. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. If you're on TikTok, if you're on IG, please leave them in the comments. I will post all of the videos together in one video here on Instagram and also on YouTube. Let's get started, shall we? Chapter 1 opens and it's called Betty's Daughter. Betty is Ona Judge's mother. However, the documentation of Ona Judge's lineage starts with the Washingtons, specifically Martha Washington, who was the daughter of, who was married to Daniel Custis. Now, what's interesting to know that she was married to Daniel Custis before George Washington, and when he died, she inherited a lot. Martha Washington was a slave owner of 300 slaves, 6 plantations, and she owned 17,500 acres. That's very interesting because most of the time when we hear about slavery, we never talk about how white women owned slaves and how they got to owning slaves and their wealth that they generated and passed down to their children. Now, it's interesting how they compare and contrast Betty and Martha, because Martha was going through this phase where she was losing children. So whether it's through miscarriage, whether it's through illness, her children were dying. And while her children were dying, Betty was also having children, and Betty was a slave. She was a dower slave, which means that she was previously owned by Martha's first husband, and he would be her master. George Washington, ironically, when he married Martha, her children, Betty's children, were not they would not consider him to be their master. Which was ironic because typically the more children a slave has, the wealthier the slave owner became. However, her 4 children that were mentioned were not his slaves. They were Martha's. Betty was 21 years old when Martha and George Washington married. So this would be Martha and her second husband. Remember, her first husband was Daniel Custis, and he died like 1757. And so Betty was at first concerned because George wasn't in the same financial status as Martha, who was balling at the time. She had all the slaves, she had all the property, etc. But he welcomed Martha's slaves because it looks good on his paper. However, Martha was still going through troubles with losing children. Betty was making more children because she was also in her prime. She had Austin, Tom, and Betty Davis. Later, she goes on to have Annie. Now, it gets a little bit more interesting. So, it's not clear if Betty had a consensual relationship or an assault relationship with Andrew Judge. Andrew Judge is Oni Judge's father. Andrew Judge was this white indentured servant, right? And he was from England, where he contracted out his freedom to get to the Americas. And George Washington saw him and purchased him, and he came to be on the Washington plantation at Mount Vernon. He worked for 4 years and then he gained his freedom, because that's how indentured servitude works and not slavery. So when people like to say that white people were slaves, no, they were not. They could contract their freedom, get paid for it, and then still be free. Black people could not. So chattel slavery in America worked this way. Betty was black. Betty was a slave. Her children were slaves because Betty was a slave. Slavery followed the path of the mother because, just so you know, Black women are the most disenfranchised group in America. and black women were considered less than, like below less than. As far as humanization goes, as far as profits go, they were valuable in that sense. But their humanity was not valued. Their children were profits, not human beings, according to their slave masters. Andrew Judge, Ona Judge's father, purchased a house after he was freed and left Ona and her mama Betty and did not purchase their freedom. He abandoned them and took his freedom and left. Now, as far as children work, children started to work as early as 19 to 14. Anybody else younger than that or was physically incapable were left to their own devices. So a lot of them were lonely. A lot of them witnessed brutal assaults on other slaves, and some also were assaulted. A lot of early deaths for children was common, whether it was through accidental fires or drownings. Children often were not allowed to live with both of their parents. George Washington was really cruel. He either sold them or he kept them on separate farms so that they could only ask permission to see their full families together. So that ends chapter 1, but I just want to say it's interesting how George Washington made it so that families had to have permission to see one another. Like, can you imagine the psychological toll that it took on black people who were enslaved by George Washington to have to say, I can't see my child, I can't see my wife, I can't see my husband, I can't see my mother, my father, nothing until I get permission from my slave master to see them, to love them, to hug them, to kiss them. Like, I'm not allowed. That type of isolation is cruel. I'm interested in knowing your thoughts. Drop me a Q&A if you're on TikTok. Drop me a comment on Instagram or YouTube, and I'll be happy to compile your questions and go through them, especially on TikTok and my Instagram stories and even my YouTube shorts.